Well, anyhow, I want to welcome Ai-Min Lee. Thank you for coming here. This is part of our ACSM Distinguished Leaders video series, and I've done probably 30 some of these, so I'm glad you could agree to do this today.
Well, thank you. It really is my privilege to be doing this with you.
Oh, good. So one of the things I wanted to start with is if you could just sort of tell us where you're at right now, what you're doing, your research, and that type of thing.
Well, my primary research interest is actually in physical activity and health, but where I work, we are all funded entirely by research money. So my research interests actually span the gamut of physical activity research that my primary interest is in, as well as other kinds of research that bring funding into our research group. So I'm working on studies that are related to cardiovascular disease, that are related to cancer. I have an interesting project that actually I would not think I would have been interested in, except that Dow Corning gave us some money years ago when there was a concern that breast implants would be related to connective tissue diseases. So I've also started working on connective tissue disease just because of that funding. But what I'm primarily interested in is physical activity and its effects on health. And I consider myself an epidemiologist. So when I started out in the field, I sort of rather naively considered myself the scientist that would look at data that would tell you, what kinds of diseases that physical activity might protect against. And I really wasn't interested in what I considered the messy part of the research, which was the translation, how you get people to being physically active. I thought that all I would do would be the research part of it, and there'd be another group of experts, people that got out in the field. But over the years, I've increasingly realized that you can't really separate out the two, that doing research for the sake of research itself isn't very useful and probably is less exciting. So what I've been working on these days are really questions that are related to public health. So everybody knows physical activity is good for you, but to the public, especially the sedentary American public, they want to know details about the kinds of physical activity that one should be doing, because it's, I think, human nature. You sort of try to see what the least is that you can do to get benefit.
What can I get away with?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I've been working on questions like, exactly how much physical activity do you need? Is there a dose-response relationship?
Sure.
If you do a little bit, do you get a little bit of benefit? If you do more, do you get more benefit? Does it differ for the different diseases? And we've had a sea change over the last 10 years. We used to tell people to do vigorous intensity activity. Now it's okay to do moderate intensity physical activity. We used to say you needed to do your activity continuously, and now we say you can accumulate your physical activity. So the kinds of
short your bouts are okay?
Yeah, so rather than doing one long bout of physical activity, research now shows that you certainly do get benefit if you go out for, say, 3 10-minute walks throughout the day, or 2 15-minute walks throughout the day. And this wasn't always what was recommended. But it is interesting that when you talk to people and tell them that it helps the people who are really sedentary, because the idea of having to go out and, say, take a 30-minute walk might be very daunting. So if you say start slow, start 10 minutes, that works out fine. But I found that there's a group of individuals that sort of look at you puzzledly and say, why would I want to sweat 3 times a day? I'd rather sweat once a day.
Once and get it over with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it drives home the point that I think increasingly we're shaping a message regarding physical activity for the population that is more a generic recommendation rather than one size fits all. Our latest recommendation, which takes into account some of the research that we have been fortunate enough to conduct, as well as other groups, showing that you can sort of put your own program together. If you like doing only moderate activity, fine. If you like doing only vigorous activity, fine. If you like doing combinations, fine, so long as the total reaches a certain minimum.
I see.
You want to do it for half an hour? Fine. You want to do it for 10 minutes? Fine. So it's a more flexible message, I believe.
Yeah. And now you're at Harvard, right?
I am at Harvard.
Okay. And how long have you been there?
Oh, I've been there forever and a day. It's interesting because when I started out, I wasn't interested in physical activity. And the person who brought me on board is Ralph Paffenbarger.
I was going to ask about
Jr.
him sooner, or later, I mean, but
Yeah.
sooner is fine. Yeah.
Well, I really am very grateful for him for bringing me into this field, because when I first started out in Harvard, I was doing a master's in public health. My training, I'm a medical doctor, and I'd always been interested in statistics. So I came over to Harvard to do a master's in public health, thinking that I would be able to use some of my statistical expertise to do some sort of health research. But when I did my master's program, I realized that I was very interested in research, and probably more interested in research than the clinical aspects of medicine. So I thought about doing a doctoral program, and I came here as a citizen of a foreign country, so a lot of the scholarships that are available to US citizens were not available to me. So my professor said, well, you know, I think you should go and work in the field for a while before you sink all this money into a PhD program, which is really great advice. So of the recommendations that I got, I ended up at Stanford University working not with Ralph Paffenbarger, but with a colleague of his called Alice Whittemore. And I was and am still interested in the development of cancer, factors that help prevent cancer. And so PAF was on the faculty with Alice Whittemore, and you know PAF. He's just the friendliest person. He'll stop by and talk to everyone. And he told me about his study, and I unfortunately was such an ignorant student that I didn't know anything about him. So of course I wasn't intimidated by the fact that this was Ralph Paffenbarger.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about his studies other than the fact that he had a lot of data, and a lot of data meant messy data. And I was thinking, I don't know that I want to be a student working on this messy data. I'd rather work on a small, clean, contained data set and finish my doctoral degree. But he was just the most persistent person.
When was this?
This was in 1987.
Okay.
So he would say, oh, you really should get involved in this study. Oh, you know, there's such a lot of data on these men. They're such interesting people. Well, you were at Harvard. You should be interested in the alumni. And so, you know, eventually he wore me down. I can't say that it was my acumen.
No.
I couldn't say no because he was so persistent. And this is why I always say I'll be very grateful to him. It wasn't that I had the foresight to see that physical activity would be such a preventive measure. I didn't have the foresight to realize what a wealth of data he had. I knew he was a lovely gentleman, but I didn't know what a great mentor he would be. So I really fell into this field by accident.
Yeah. Well, now, where did you do your MD degree?
I was born in Malaysia, went to school in Malaysia, went to high school in Malaysia, and then I went to medical school in Singapore.
Oh, okay.
And then I did my, it's a slightly different system. It's a British system. So we had something called a housemanship, which is sort of like the internship.
Okay.
And then I did my medical officer posting in family medicine. And that was when I would thought, you know, I'd do some clinical work, but I was really interested in research. I would
do an MPH.
Yeah.
And then you came to Harvard then
from Singapore. That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
And then after I did my MPH, I thought, oh, gee, I really like this. I really like epidemiology. So that was when I met Ralph Paffenbarger. I decided to apply to a doctoral program. And at that time, I was out in Stanford. So rather than moving back to the East Coast again, I actually was very interested in UC Berkeley because it was just nearby, and I thought I wouldn't have to relocate. And Paff, being the sort of person he was, he didn't try to influence my decision. He said, oh, that's a very good school. You should go talk to the people. And, you know, I talked to the people, and I had a position at UC Berkeley, but I also did apply to Harvard. I thought, why not? You know, I knew the professors, and I also knew quite a few of the students in my master's program who had gone on to the doctoral program immediately. So I still had friends there. So I ended up with a place in both schools, and, you know, I was thinking about which school I should go to, and then I decided to go to Harvard. You know, it was probably, I'm not really sure what led to my decision, because the move was a con, but my friends there were a plus. I knew the professors, so I sort of knew their temperament in terms of additional coursework I had to take. I guess that tipped the favor the balance in favor of Harvard. And after I decided that I would go to Harvard, I told Pav, I'll go back to Harvard. And Pav said, well, that is exactly the right decision you should be making. But he never said one way or the other while I was still deciding.
Yeah.
He thought it was something that I should decide myself. And I'm willing to bet that if I said I'd stay in Berkeley, he would have been perfectly supportive of that.
I'm sure he would have.
Yeah.
Well, did you know Bill Haskell then? Was he at Stanford then? Or?
Yes, Bill Haskell was at Stanford then, but I don't believe I met him till several years later when I became a member of ACSM.
Yeah. Okay.
As I said, I was an extremely ignorant student then, knew nothing about the field of physical activity, and my interest at that time was cancer epidemiology, and I was working on this rare T-cell lymphoma that occurred in the skin, and that was the field I was in.
Did you end up doing your dissertation then, dealing with physical activity?
Yes,
back at Harvard?
I did.
Okay.
So I ended up doing my dissertation on physical activity and cancer using Ralph Paffenbarger's data, and he was my advisor.
Oh, good.
I've always considered him my true advisor, even though at Harvard he wasn't my formal advisor because his primary appointment was at Stanford and his secondary appointment was at Harvard. So there was another colleague, Professor Shea, who agreed to be my primary advisor, though he knew Pav well, and the understanding always was that he would be my primary advisor in name, but Pav would be my true advisor for my dissertation.
Right. And then you finished your degree and stayed on at Harvard.
I did, and I think that's the fascinating part about research, probably in any field. As I said, when I started, I didn't know much about it, but the more I started to work on physical activity, the more interesting the field became. All these unanswered questions, all these physical activity disease relationships, what remain unknown in the field, what kinds of research should be done to advance the field. And so I got more and more interested in that. And when I graduated with my doctoral degree, I actually was considering going back to Singapore, and I had applied for a position at the University of Singapore, which is where I got my medical degree from. My family is in Malaysia, I have family in Singapore, and I did get a faculty position, but at the same time, over at Harvard, there was a new study that was starting up, the Women's Health Study, and they were looking for a project director at that time, and one of my professors recommended that I be selected for this position. And so I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't turn this down. Maybe I should do this for a couple of years to gain additional experience, and then I'll go back home. Well, the couple of years turned into more than a couple of years, and before you know it, I've been here for, more than 10 years.
Is that project still going?
Yes, that is actually another of the main studies that I'm working on. I still work on Ralph Paffenbarger's Harvard Alumni Health Study.
Yes, yeah.
And
that's a long time.
Yeah.
That's a lot of data.
That's a lot of data. And it's been valuable because as the men have grown older, it's afforded us opportunity to look at some of the diseases that occur more commonly when people get older, and looking at issues such as relative intensity of physical activity, because when individuals grow older, we always say moderate exercise at 3 to 6 METs, but 3 to 6 METs is probably moderate for someone who is middle age, perhaps up to the age 60. Once you get older than that, 3 METs may even be vigorous. So for these older men, we're able to show that in older individuals, rather than relying on the absolute MET values, it's probably the relative intensity. How hard does it feel relative to the person? That is important when you look at intensity. So the Women's Health Study is this other study that I work on. It started as a randomized clinical trial looking at aspirin and vitamin E in the prevention of heart disease in women, because when it started, we knew that aspirin was useful for preventing second heart attacks in men and women that already had heart attacks. We knew it was useful for preventing first heart attacks in men, But aspirin, while it seems like a very innocent drug, it also increases the risk of bleeding. So it protects against heart attacks.
So it's a blood thinner, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a blood thinner, and
Yeah.
it might cause bleeding in the brain. Now, in men have high rates of heart attack and relatively low rates of stroke. So the balance of risks and benefits works for them.
Yeah.
But in women, especially prior to menopause, our heart disease rates are much lower, but our risks of stroke remain about the same as men. So the
Okay.
balance of risks and benefits were not as clear in women. So this was how the study got started.
So you were the first director of that study?
I was the first director of that study.
Okay, and when was that?
That started in 1992.
Okay.
And the principal investigators of the study at that time were Dr. Julie Burring and Dr. Charles Hannekens. And Dr. Hannekens has left, and Dr. Julie Burring and I now co-lead the study. And, even at that time, we did know that physical activity is important for heart disease. So in a big study like that, this involves 40,000
I was going to
women.
ask how many. What's your N? It's pretty
40
big.
40,000.
Wow.
So there are a lot of co-investigators in the study, and everyone wants to study their favorite topic.
Yes.
So my favorite topic was physical activity. So we've managed to put a physical activity component into this study. And the trial has now ended. The trial ended in 2004, but the women are still being followed long-term in an observational study. And it's great because we've now had 13 years of physical activity data in these women. And so it allows us to answer important questions for women, particularly related to long-term physical activity patterns. And the latest project that I've been working on is the very important question of how much physical activity women need in order to prevent unhealthy weight gain over time. And obesity is such a major problem in the US.
Yes.
And our environments are such that we just do so much less physical activity than our parents used to do. And so weight is creeping up. And so Professor Steve Blair believes that you don't really need 60 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity, which is what the Institute of Medicine recommends. He doesn't believe that you need that much physical activity to maintain weight. But unfortunately, I've just finished this project, and it looks like, at least in our data in these women, overall, they do need 60 minutes a day to be able to maintain their weight. For the ones who are normal weight with a normal BMI, it looks like there's more of a dose-response relationship. If you do a little bit of it, you can control your weight a little bit. If you do more, you can control it more. But for the group as a whole, it looks like 60 minutes a day of moderate intensity physical activity is needed to prevent this unhealthy weight creep.
And you have some kind of a standard for caloric intake then? Or
This
you would think that would have a big effect.
Exactly, because weight obviously is a balance between what we eat and what we put out. We do assess diet in these women, and we use what we call a semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire, which is like a long questionnaire that has 131 items, and women report it. Now, it's obviously not as accurate as an experiment where you can measure the food, but for a large cohort of women, I think it's a reasonable measure. And what I was particularly interested in this project is, I think diets don't really work that well, in the sense that, yes, anybody can go on a diet for a short period of time, but to be able to maintain that long term, that's really hard. So the question I actually tried to set out answering is, okay, let's just assume the women are eating whatever they are eating, which is what the normal US population is eating. What do you need to do to maintain your weight? And because we had this diet information, we were able to control for diet differences between the people who did, say, 30 minutes a day, the people who did 60 minutes a day. So we were able to adjust for the differences in calories. But with the average diet that a woman takes in the US, a middle-aged and older woman, it looks like this is the level of physical activity that we need. And
well, so how did you get involved with the American College of Sports Medicine?
And again, our good friend Ralph Poffenbarger was the one who got me involved.
I thought maybe it was Steve.
It's I would say it's a combination of both of them, because I was still a doctoral student at the time that Pav turned 70. So they had this big Fleischschrift for him, and they had a symposium. And Steve Blair and Bill Cole had organized a program where they asked various colleagues of Pat, his contemporaries, those who were ahead of him, and his younger colleagues, including the students, to present. And at that time, I wasn't a member.
I see. Okay.
You know, in order to be able to get discounted student rates, if you became a member, it was cheaper to come to the annual meeting. And so I would say a combination of both of them. Pat's birthday, Pat for getting me involved in physical activity, and Steve for organizing the event. And then when I came here, it was fascinating to me to see such a big group of individuals all doing research on physical activity and doing the range of research on physical activity, all the way from basic science to very translational community approaches to physical activity. And you know, you make friends and you stay connected, and then you want to see these people year after year. You find out about the kinds of research people are doing, you want to know more about what's happening. And so that initial encounter brought me to the annual meeting each and every year. And as I started coming, you know, ACSM is run entirely by volunteers. All the boards are members who volunteer their time. So I started getting involved in things like the Research Advisory Committee, you know, various review committees for the different awards, the journals, and it just helped me to get to know the people here, to feel connected with the main body, to feel very admiring actually for the wide range and breadth of things that the people here do, including lobbying for physical activity on a national scale.
Really moving on now. I mean, I talked to Russ Pate this morning, and he was talking about all the stuff, of course, that he's done, similar to some of the things that you've done with epidemiological studies, and how important that data has been to keep building that data to be able to finally make some inroads on politically possible.
Right. And I was just joking with some of the members in this meeting. I was saying that we've achieved rock star status because did you see, I guess maybe a month or so back, our president, Mindy, she rang the closing bell at the stock exchange, and I was thinking, wow, ACSM people don't do that. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger does that, but not ACSM people.
Yeah, we were all hoping the stocks would go up too, but that hasn't happened.
And you know, ACSM has just played such a fantastic leadership role in terms of putting forward the recommendations for physical activity, the 1995 CDC ACSM recommendations, the 2007 update, and you know, ACSM has been very instrumental in helping publicize the 2008 DHHS recommendations. So I really admire what the people in the society have done in terms of trying to get our message for physical activity for everybody, physical activity for health.
Yeah, Russ was also saying that in his opinion, he thought ACSM embraced epidemiology at a point in time when a lot of other groups weren't. And he spoke about Ralph and how important PAF was in making that bridge, and I see that he brought you in with him. So
yeah, PAF was definitely instrumental because I would say that he, together with Professor Jerry Morris in London, were pioneers in the epidemiology field, but there are many others who have contributed, you know, of course, Steve Blair, Russ Pate. Ken Powell was instrumental in building a physical activity branch within the CDC itself, you know, and then of course Bill Haskell, Art Leon, and I know I'm leaving out people, but you know, all these leaders who have brought the field to where it is, to a stature of respectability, so to speak. In fact, I think when I was in medical school, and if I said that I was doing epidemiology and physical activity, people would look at me and think, what? I mean, don't you want to be a surgeon? Don't you want to be, you know, a neurosurgeon?
Why would you waste your time?
Exactly, exactly.
So on that note, do you miss the clinical side of things, or?
Unfortunately, not in the U.S., you know, because our healthcare system is unfortunately in such bad shape, and my colleagues who are doing clinical medicine in the U.S., there's always a pressure to recoup the money so that your institute doesn't lose money. So in this sense, I don't miss it in the US, but I still go back and visit my colleagues in Malaysia and Singapore, and I think I do miss it somewhat. There's this interaction and being able to influence an individual at a time. And I do miss that somewhat.
To make a change right away.
Yeah.
And that was your intent, really, to go back and practice
Right.
in Singapore.
Right.
So we can blame PAF.
Well, you know, I think I'm very happy with the way my life turned out, so I shouldn't say blame PAF.
I know. So I remember seeing a lot of your articles in New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. How has the receptivity been in these mainstream medical journals to the type of research that you're doing? I mean, that seems like a sea change, in my opinion, since the mid-90s, maybe.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I think the general scientific field, the general medical field, is increasingly realizing that physical activity has an enormous impact on health. I think we in the exercise world have always seen the data and believed it, but I think now with much more understanding of biologic mechanisms, you know, what physical activity can do to, for example, the endothelial function of the coronary arteries, what it can do to inflammation, you know, things that seem much more hard science. Then it makes it more real for a lot of the people. And we've also had a lot of studies, including very well done clinical trials, large scale, multi-site, international, looking at trials of physical activity in terms of, for example, type 2 diabetes, which is really important now because of the obesity epidemic, and people increasingly realizing that physical activities benefit on health is of the magnitude that you would see if you ask people to stop smoking, if you ask people to maintain normal weight, if you ask people to maintain normal blood pressure, maintain glucose levels and insulin levels. So it's not like some minor risk factor out there, but you know, it's as big as the big risk factors that we see. Plus, it's something that influences not just mortality, chronic disease outcomes, but things like, you know, your functional health, depression, things that become increasingly more important with the population growing older. So I think you're right that you're probably more likely to see physical activity articles in sort of the mainstream medical journals, whereas in the past you might see more in the physical activity journals and perhaps some of the heart disease journals.
Yeah. What are we doing? Oh, wow, time. So I told you 30 minutes.
Is it really?
Fast, but anyhow, I just wondered in the sort of the end if you could, in concluding, to just maybe look at ACSM and think, you know, are we doing the right thing at the right time? There's been some discussions at this meeting about too much on public policy, and we're abandoning science, and which I don't really see myself, but that is, people have been talking about that. But I think what you said earlier is the importance of the applicability of the research.
I think this is a challenge that faces any organization when it gets very large and very successful, because when you have a large group of individuals, there's probably a wide range of interests, and human nature being the way it is, you know, we are always interested in promoting our own field. So I think that always, not just now, but I think in previous years, you know, I've heard people say, oh, there's too much basic science. Oh, there's too much public health. Oh, there's too much clinical medicine. The implication being not enough of their own field.
Good point.
But I think each of these fields, they are important in their own right. And to be able to provide a compelling argument for physical activity and health, I think we need all the disciplines leading into it, the basic science, the clinical science, the population science or epidemiology. And all this knowledge really is not very useful unless we know how to disseminate it, how to translate it. So to my mind, all of these pieces are important, and I would like to see all of them affecting ACSM. And I would hope that we're all mature enough to think that we can work together.
We can get along.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that's been ACSM's strength all along, is that there was a lot of different interests out there, but everyone had a common interest in physical activity. I mean, if you look at, like you said, depression, I mean, the psychologists have played an important role in this group over the years.
Yes.
And you could go through any of the sub-disciplines, basically, and they all have an interest, and I think just shows actually the power of physical activity.
Yes.
You know, how it is medicine.
Yes, it is. It is. And Path once said, everything that gets worse as you grow older gets better as you exercise. And I love that quote.
That's a great line.
Isn't it?
And he was very active.
He was. He was. He had this talent for long distance running. And it always amazes me about the serendipity of events, because he never particularly ran when he was younger, because running was not in vogue. But he started running in his mid-40s, and my understanding from him is that he took up running at the time his eldest son was in college and was having difficulty in college, and he wanted to show his son that, if you tried something that you'd never done and you focused on it, you could succeed. And Pat found out that he was a fantastic runner. He could run marathons in like these fantastic times.
Wow.
And he ran long distance races all the way till he was 71.
Isn't that something?
But imagine if he hadn't done this to show his son, he would have had this hidden talent.
Right, and no one would have known.
No one would have known.
He wouldn't have known, And I think when I hear that story, what if he had started running when he was younger? I mean, he could have, with that kind of ability, he could have been a very, very accomplished distance runner.
He might have ended up, being an Olympic athlete and not being a professor, and then we wouldn't have our field.
Yeah, that would have changed everything.
Exactly.
Well, anyhow, thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
And talking to us, and it's been a lot of fun.